Hello and welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athlete Development Podcast. Today, we're very fortunate to have Professor David Behm with us. David, would you be able to introduce who you are and give us a bit of a background of your professional career and what you're currently doing?
Sure. Um, I'm working at Memorial University of Newfoundland. I've been here for 28 years, and I'm in the School of Human Kinetics and Recreation. My official title is University Research Professor. And so I teach courses in exercise physiology and anatomy. And then obviously I do research. And that research, I would give it an umbrella term. I would call it neuromuscular responses to exercise. And under that umbrella, I look at different responses and training adaptations with resistance training, stretching, foam rolling, fatigue, and a variety of other factors as well.
Hmm. It seems to be uncommon to find researchers who branch out in lots of different areas. You described quite a few there. Is that something that you've always tried to push to make sure you actually can expose yourself to different subfields within, say, exercise science?
Yes, absolutely. So I was a former athlete. Actually, I still consider myself an athlete, but I'm just not as good at it anymore. So when I first started off, I was hoping to become a professional football player in terms of North American football. And I was drafted into the Canadian Football League, but I only spent a month there. So I never got to the Football Hall of Fame. But I was always wondering why I didn't, make it as a football player. And one of my problems was that I was a running back, but I didn't have blazing speed. So my first interest was in speed and the velocity, specificity, resistance training. And so I did a number of pieces of research in that area. And then, it just came about that, obviously as an ex-athlete, and I've continued to train, that there's all these different types of training procedures and devices that come on, and I've always been interested. And some of these devices are very effective, and some of them are just there to make money. So then, I would go into the weight room and I'd see people, on a Swiss ball or exercise ball. Does that work? Do people who are using foam rollers, is it just a moneymaker, or does that work? And so throughout my career, I've allowed myself to, it's all neuromuscular responses. So I've got that umbrella, like I said, but I've allowed myself to go into a lot of different areas to see what are the most effective techniques for helping not only athletes, but the average citizen as well.
You know, that brings up an interesting point where it seems that there is lots of different ways you can skin a cat, so to speak, and that you see lots of people applying different types of training modalities or using specific type of interventions and touting that this is the most effective way to achieve a certain outcome. But what does that tell us about human responsiveness to exercise? It seems that there's a lot of ways that we can achieve potentially similar outcomes, but by taking different approaches.
Well, that's a great question. And I remember back when I first got my PhD, I was thinking to myself, how the heck am I going to do 30 years of research? How am I going to come up with questions for 30 years? And the thing is that, of course, if you do a lot of reading, you can see gaps in literature. The second thing is that not one study can answer all the questions.
Mm,
So, you have a study that looks at resistance training in young adults. Well, then you ask yourself, well, does that work for children? Does that work for senior adults? Does that work for women? And then resistance training. Well, is it slow resistance training or fast resistance training? Is it high intensity or is it low intensity resistance training? What about plyometrics? And then you use all that to look at the different populations again. So
mm,
it may sound like you're trying to just prolong the same question, but what happens with children is not always exactly the same. That's what's going to happen with adults, or again, what's going to happen with trained adults versus untrained adults. So
mm.
just to throw one more thing in here, we've just had a review paper accepted in sports medicine. So you said, what are the best ways to do this or to do that? So I was thinking, they always look at the best ways. So there's a lot of people out there who hate to exercise. How
Mm.
can we get them to exercise? Well, I just taught a class this morning talking about muscle hypertrophy and saying, higher volumes are typically associated with muscle hypertrophy. Well, nobody who hates exercise wants to do 5 sets of 12.
Mm.
So what we did in our review is what's the minimum amount of work you can do and still get stronger? And it turns out for the first 2 or 3 months, you could do one workout a week and do 1 set and do 6 to 12 reps and go home. Next week, come back, do one more workout of 1 set, 6 to 12 reps, go home. Of course, got to do that for a bunch of different muscle groups, but there's a good example of everybody goes and what's the best way? How do I, optimize? Well, in this review, I said, what's the least I can do? And then I can go drink beer.
The other thing I thought of too when you're talking about just participant characteristics is we also need to consider that there is individual variability when you think about, say, things like muscle phenotype and, like you suggested, training history. And it's interesting you make that point about the minimum dose, because that's also something to consider, that more is not necessarily always better too. Don't get me wrong, sometimes there can be, if you use the example
Mhm.
of hypertrophy, but there's also some people who actually may have a better response to certain training stimulus by doing it less frequently, but perhaps at a high intensity, for example. And it's something that um, I think it's something that we need to be careful when we give these sort of quote unquote best recommendations, because it might work on average to be the best, but it may not necessarily apply to the individual so effectively.
Absolutely. So I'm 66 years old and I'm
Mm,
still working out, but the average 66-year-old, so the average prescription is, say, let's say, do 3 sets of 10 and then work the same muscle group every 48 hours. So maybe Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, you work your chest, and Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, you work your legs or whatever. But when you're older, your protein synthesis slows down. So your recovery is slower than it was when you were 25 years old.
mm,
So when I was 25 years old, I could work out Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on my upper body, and then Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday on my lower. Now at 66, it's probably better for me, in order to get the most optimal gains, to work out every third day rather than every second day.
mm. And I think the other thing then to consider too is not just the effect of the stimulus, but the things you're doing outside of training then to maximize that responsiveness, and thinking about that interaction between not only the mechanical stimulus that you're applying, but then also, for instance, some of the dietary or other recovery factors that will influence the overall net synthesis of
Yeah.
protein.
And sleep patterns as well. If you don't have,
Mm.
and again, I'm relating to my senior citizen membership now. As you get older, you don't sleep as well, and if you don't
Mm.
get the proper REM sleep, then the next day you can't work out as well. So as you say, there's a lot of different factors going on that are going to affect your ability to get whatever optimal is for you. Optimal for you, being anybody in general, might be to be a bodybuilder or an Olympic athlete. The optimal program for the average individual might be to prevent injury and be able to play golf every week. In my case, it's hopefully to have a healthy lifespan for as long as I can.
One topic you've done a lot of research in is stretching. And if you want to bring up a controversial topic, bring that topic up, it seems, because it seems to be a area that brings up very differing opinions. Why is that? Why do we see such controversy and differing opinions about whether stretching is effective or not? And what does effectiveness actually mean in the context of stretching?
Yeah. Well, the problem is that the research isn't always. We use the term ecologically valid, or another term for that is practical. So I first got into stretching. I read an article in 2000 by two gentlemen named Jonathan Fowles and Digby Sale. Digby Sale happened to be my supervisor when I was doing my master's. And what they did in that piece of research was they stretched the plantar flexor muscles for 30 minutes each. Now, who stretches their plantar flexor muscles for 30 minutes? Nobody does that, especially as part of a warm up. Your warm up would take like 3 hours if you did all muscle groups. So, of course, you're going to have impairments in your performance after doing all that stretching. So, I have to admit, I didn't do much better. I read that and I said, okay, well, we got to do something different. So, we picked the quads instead of the plantar flexors. And I said, well, what if we only do 20 minutes of stretching? Well, that got a little better, but still, nobody stretches their quads for 20 minutes. So then from like that mine was in 2002, 1,000 sales was 2000. For the next 23 years, we're still doing it. You see the variables changing around and manipulating the variables. So now what we see is many of those studies, of course, the stretching was too long. Then, of course, in a warm up, what do? You just don't stretch. You usually do aerobic activity beforehand, then you do some stretching, and then you do your sport specific activity afterwards. So if you're playing Australian rules football, you'll be kicking the ball around. If you're playing soccer, again, you're doing passing and shooting, et cetera, et cetera. But most of these studies didn't do that. So for the last 15 years or so, we've all been seeing, oh, static stretching causes impairments. Well, we have, and you had Tony Blazevich on in another segment, and Tony and I co-authored a paper where we had people do an aerobic activity beforehand. Then Tony and I and others have recommended that you should be doing less than 60 seconds of static stretching in a warm-up per muscle group. So we did that. Then we added some dynamic activities afterwards. So lo and behold, what happened? There's no impairments. If you do the right thing and have a full warm-up, there shouldn't be any impairments. So the problem is that, as scientists, we're minimalists or reductionists. And so we take this particular study and then we start taking pieces of it. And what we need to do is we need to bring it together. So like I say, Tony and I did that one. We've had a few other ones in our lab where we've also shown when you add aerobic activity and the right amount of static stretching, there's no problems.
David, can I ask a question about the history of that? Because it seems like the design of those studies, and I'm not trying to be annoying with this, but it seems like you were trying to prove that stretching didn't work with the design of the studies. Was that ever the intention?
No, it wasn't the intention. So I'll tell you about Fowles and Sale. Their intention was not to look at impairments in performance after stretching. They actually were looking at animal studies on stretching, where they stretched animal muscles for a prolonged period of time. And the animals, such as chicken, latissimus dorsi muscles and rats, etc., hypertrophied. So they were wondering if they could do something the same in humans. They just happened to find, when they were measuring force, that force went down. And boom, it went off their head, said, well, that's interesting. Let's publish that. So it wasn't even their intention to look at performance, but they found this interesting finding. And that led on to, hundreds of other studies that have now followed that. And so then what you do, you start off from the extreme, which is what Fowles and Sales did. And now you start moving down to the more practical. And finally, in the last 5-7 years or so, we're getting down to very practical types of routines that, as I say, are showing that you're not seeing those impairments that we saw in the early stages of stretching research.
Excuse my ignorance if this exists and I don't know about it, but you hear a similar thing from some of the bodybuilders about improved adaptations from stretching prior to actually doing their, say, hypertrophy training. And is there evidence to suggest that if you actually cause an impairment on purpose in terms of the force output, that the actual adaptation to the training will be greater because you've essentially created a stimulus that is more difficult for that, that muscle system or that area of the body to actually have to overcome?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not really sure on that. So there is research out there that has interspersed stretching between sets and found that forces went down, performance went down as well. But you're right.
And is there long-term adaptation you get by sort of making that task harder by having the force actually drop off?
Yeah, so you could argue that if you were an Olympic weightlifter, you would not want that to happen. You want to lift the heaviest weights possible. As a bodybuilder, obviously they're very, very strong, but they're not worried about setting world records for, bench press and I'm trying to think of the
like the clean and jerk and the
clean and
snatch.
jerk. That's right. Yeah. So they're more worried in muscle hypertrophy. So you're right. They can get more stress on the muscle by applying some stretching and combining it with the resistance training. In fact, I'm a co-author with a colleague of mine who now is in Austria. His name's Konstantin Varnaka. And he did a series of studies where he stretched people's calf muscles or plantar flexors. In his first study, he did it for 2 hours, 5 days a week for 6 weeks. And then he measured their strength and hypertrophy, and it went up. All they had to do was sit there and watch TV or work on their computer, and he had this orthotic device that would keep their calf muscle under stretch. So once again, just like Thousand Sales, he's saying to himself, well, who the heck is going to stretch one muscle group for 2 hours? It's not very efficient. So then he went down to 1 hour. He still found strength and hypertrophy gains. Then he went down in his last year to 10 minutes. And with 10 minutes of constant stretching, he found strength and hypertrophy gains. So yes, stretching even on its own. Now this was with untrained people. I don't think you'd find significant gains with highly trained people just by sitting there in a stretch position. But still, just static stretching can improve your strength and hypertrophy.
Are you able to maybe sort of, even if it's not necessarily clear from the literature, but what do you think is going on there? What do you think is the mechanism that is driving that? And maybe why do you think it will happen in an untrained population, but not in a trained population?
Well, of course, the major signal for muscle hypertrophy, and of course, the muscle cross-sectional areas related to the strength or force output, is the tension on the muscle. So normally we think, okay, we need a lot of tension. We're going to do big bench press. We're going to do some big squats. But we've shown here that even a stretch with a constant tension on the muscle will provide that. So you've got this receptor on the muscle membrane. It's called the integrin receptor. I find it easy to remember because it reminds me of the word integrity. So the integrin receptor tells you about the integrity of the membrane. So if you're doing resistance training, you typically cause micro tears in that membrane. And therefore, what the system wants to do is to make sure that next time that muscle is bigger and stronger and that same load doesn't cause damage. So if you're going to stretch a muscle for 10 minutes or up to 2 hours, the integrin molecule is telling the system, this is unaccustomed stress. And therefore, what we need to do is we have to increase the protein synthesis. And there's this compound in your nucleus called the mTOR-RAPTOR complex. And it will ramp up the protein synthesis so you have a bigger muscle just by putting tension on it.
A question I wanted to ask, it goes back to actually something John asked before. We're thinking about applying stretching potentially for longer durations to, say, impair the neuromuscular system, and then doing subsequent, say, resistance training, because I know there's one of the mechanisms that can influence a force deficit from prolonged stretching is a reduction in the persistent inward currents that occur that help drive that firing frequency. So it's something that I've thought about before and we've discussed, and I'm interested to know if you know of any research of whether you can actually apply something like stretching for a longer duration, so maybe for, let's say, 3 to 5 minutes, so you might be seeing potentially an impairment, followed by doing like, say, an explosive type exercise, where it starts to then require a particular component of the neuromuscular system to work in, say, overdrive to compensate for that deficit in the persistent inward current.
I would normally recommend against that because if you want to do explosive work, what you want to do is you want to have the highest rate of force development possible. You want to teach the system how to fire at the highest possible frequency. So your motor neurons can fire at 80 to 120 hertz when you're doing ballistic type of contractions. So if we want the system to become accustomed to firing at the highest frequencies, I don't think that providing a stressor that decreases that would be an optimal situation.
Do you think that fits, that model and that idea fits across more training in general in terms of the structure of how you apply stress? That it's about maximizing the performance in that specific task rather than making that task specifically stressful? Like an example I would give is I work in track and field, and I'm sure you've seen, the invention of all these overspeed type systems that are coming out. And people talk about, well, I think, that you need to expose people to running at speeds at or greater than their maximal speed consistently. And the argument always goes is, do you want them actually to be exposed to that because of the stress that it creates on the overall neuromuscular system and potentially some of those central systems that drive that? Or is it not so much about being exposed to that? Because I always think about this, even for some of the athletes that I coach when we're training, say in the colder months of the year, and their their overall output is going to be lower, right? I mean, obviously, there's contextual things. There's obviously temperature, all those kind of things. So they don't actually run as fast, but they're trying at 100% of their effort. Are they getting the same adaptation because the effort is there, even though the external output is not? Or do you need to actually be making that external output as high as possible, i.e. what you mentioned with the ballistic training just then?
Yeah. Well, first I would argue you're in Australia. Do you actually get cold down there? I
Yeah,
don't think you well, your version of cold is not my version of cold, but
For
nonetheless,
no,
sure.
no, no. But you guys have indoor facilities, which we don't. So
that's right.
you guys don't. You guys are lucky in that sense.
That's right. So yeah, so that's another great point as well. So if I'm going to do something that needs um, fine motor control, so if I'm sprinting, I have to have a very rapid stretch shortening cycle. I have to hit the ground and take off really quickly. So a good example would be plyometrics. So of course, plyometrics is hopping, bounding, jumping, etc., etc. So plyometrics is only effective if when you hit the ground, you take off as rapidly as possible. You want to get that reactive strength. So a number that's normally thrown around is that if you're on the ground for more than 200 or 250 milliseconds, you're doing it too slow. So therefore, if I introduce a stressor like stretching, that makes me stay on the ground, and again, the scientific term amortization phase is 250 milliseconds or more, then the plyometrics isn't going to work properly. On the other hand, again, if we're just talking about strength and hypertrophy, I'm a bodybuilder, or again, a North American football player, I'm a rugby player, I'm a ice hockey player from Canada, and I want to get big, then I don't have to worry about the fine motor control. I'm just worrying about putting stress on the system. So I think you're right that in those cases, I could add stretching either before or between sets, and then I'd actually probably be putting less load on my system because I can't lift as much, which actually might be good for me because then I've got less tension on my tendons, and therefore I might be less likely to cause overuse injuries. But if we've got to do something that's explosive, it's got to be like plyometrics, then I need to be explosive and have the best firing rates that I can do, the highest recruitment that I can do. And so the answer is if it's really coordinated and explosive, I don't want to have any other stressors like prolonged stretching affecting that.
Mm.
So does that suggest that you then want to maybe truncate recovery between, say, sets and things like that, so that you're maximizing the output that they can create within, say, if it's like a jump task set or something like that?
Yeah. So for instance, let's compare bodybuilders to Olympic weightlifters. If you're a bodybuilder, you do your set, then typically you only take a minute rest, maybe 2 minutes rest, and you go back and do it. So your second set is not going to be as good as your first set because, of course, there's fatigue. There's probably hydrogen ion buildup. If you've got acidic environment, lactate, et cetera, et cetera. But, again, you're not worried about lifting the heaviest weights in the world. The Olympic weightlifter is. So the Olympic weightlifter will probably take 5 minutes or more between sets. So he gets rid of the acidity, the hydrogen ions, the lactate. And if he or she was lifting 100 kilograms the first time, they want to be lifting 100 kilograms the second set. So again, depending on your goals, you may want to have optimal force or power outputs in each set. Or if you're a bodybuilder or just interested in getting larger, then you don't need, you can have those shorter rest periods. And actually, we know that with shorter rest periods, there's a signal that you increase testosterone release. And that's what bodybuilders are after, of course.
How would this differ in the neuromuscular development of youth athletes, in the sense that obviously they have less characteristics that they've already developed, How would you you mentioned it earlier, so I thought it was important that we come back to this at some stage. But how would you attack that? Because obviously they're not going to, well, I'm going to assume, and you can correct me if you think it's different in this, but they're not going to be able to tolerate that level of intensity in what they do. So what's the difference in how you would structure that based on, the neuromuscular research and what's important for development and use, say resistance training, for instance?
Mm. Well, from what we found in our studies with youth, is that they're surprisingly more resilient than we think. And so, of course, you start off with a child or a youth who hasn't lifted before. The most important thing is the motor learning component, how to do things properly. But then you can start adding the stresses. Now, when you said they can't handle this as much intensity, well, it's relative. Obviously, they can't handle the absolute loads of an adult, but they can still work at 70 or 80% of their maximum once they've achieved the coordination to do the exercises properly. Now, what typically happens with the children is that they they don't tend to be able to activate to the same extent that adults do. We push ourselves harder. And so they will naturally not lift as much because, if we can, let's say, activate 95% of our quadriceps during a squat, their activation would be lower than that. So naturally, absolutely, they'll have less stress, but relatively as well, because they'll be at a lower activation level. But the emphasis for children is to make sure that the motor learning aspect comes first. And then, of course, the fun aspect, because psychologically, they're not going to push themselves like we do. And you certainly have to add more variety in their programs to keep them motivated.
Actually, the topic I want to go back to is look the stretching. We sort of went off on a few different tangents there, but one of the other areas with stretching that I feel like doesn't get discussed a lot is different stretch variables. So we can think about things like stretch type when you think of, say, dynamic, static, ballistic stretching. But then I think the other really important ones that can be a bit tricky to um, quantify, at least in the real world, is things like intensity, and then other ones like frequency, duration, and so on. Is there much research in the area of stretching that has explored those different variables? And do we have an understanding of how we configure them to influence certain acute or chronic adaptations?
Sure, there's a preponderance of studies out there. The problem is that people get confused. So you have a study that looks at warm-up effects. So I've done who knows how many studies in stretching and warm-up effects, and again with Tony Blazevich and Tony Kay and a number of other people, we've said less than 60 seconds of static stretching per muscle group is recommended. But that's for a warm-up. If you want to have the greatest increases in range of motion, then what you want to do is you want to have it as a separate session. And during that separate session, you're not worried about, going out and shooting baskets or playing soccer or whatever afterwards. So the duration should be longer if you're using your stretching as a separate session. So you may be looking at 2 to 3 minutes of stretching per muscle group rather than less than 60. Typically, it's recommended to go to the point of discomfort, but there's a number of studies out there show that you don't have to go to the point of discomfort. So you can go, to the initial point of discomfort, not your maximum point of discomfort, and still get great results in terms of increasing range of motion.
On that note, because I know you recently published an article with, I think it was the primary author was Conrad, I believe,
Andreas
talking about
Conrad from Austria. Yeah.
yeah, and I had to read through that, and I didn't come across the fact that you talked about intensity not being that important. But then I think about some individual studies I've come across. Like I know there's a few by is it Freitas or Freitas? Like I'm not sure how you pronounce
Mhm.
his name. There's also another one recently from a Japanese group last year that I think it was Hamato, showing that higher intensities did induce greater effects in terms of improvements in flexibility. And I guess for me, just thinking about it from first principles standpoint, it seemed to make sense where intensity is an important variable for inducing larger effects. I think about when you have higher intensity, typically you're going to have a bit more active contraction, which creates more tension for the myofascial system. So it helps you better adapt to thinking of being able to tolerate higher tensions. But you're suggesting that that may not always necessarily need to be the case?
Well, again, it depends what group are we talking about. So you're right. If we're talking about athletes who want to achieve the greatest range of motion, you probably want to put more stress on the system, therefore go to your maximum point of discomfort. If we're talking about the average individual who just wants to get a functional range of motion, then the research shows you don't need to go to the maximal point of discomfort.
Mm. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I think the other interesting one too to consider with stretching is one, it is subjective. So what does that actually mean? But then the other one too of when you stretch, the body does relax to a certain point. So, do you think it's something that we want to keep trying to encourage people to go deeper and deeper as they get obviously more comfortable with the position?
Yes, absolutely. So there's a concept called stretch tolerance or pain tolerance. So I often, demonstrate in my class where I'll stretch my hamstrings and I'll reach out. And when I first reach out, I might reach to the first joint on my fingers. And as I keep on talking for 30 seconds, then I can go to the second joint. I keep on talking for another 30 seconds, I can go to the third joint. So what's happening is I'm becoming more accustomed to the discomfort associated with that. It can be both psychological and be both physiological. So psychological, I'm stretching there. The system thinks there's discomfort, there's pain. We don't want that. That can cause injury. Therefore, we're going to contract that muscle in order to protect it. But after a period of time, the system realizes that, well, this isn't going to cause injury, and the system can then increase the parasympathetic and allow you to relax, and you can go farther and farther. Physiologically, again, if you're going to provide discomfort or pain, there's this theory called the diffuse noxious inhibitory control theory. And with this DNIC, when you have pain, that information is sent back up to your brain, and then your brain has these things called convergent neurons in the brainstem. They release endorphins and enkephalins. So it's like you're sticking morphine in your body, and that decreases the amount of pain your pain sensitivity throughout the body, and then you can push yourself farther. A great example of that is we've done a number of pieces of research on what I call non-local stretching effects. So if you stretch your right hamstrings and then go over and test your left hamstrings, they'll have more flexibility. You don't even have to touch them. Just stretch the other one. We've also done where we've stretched the shoulders and then tested the hamstrings. The hamstrings had more flexibility. We then stretched the hamstrings and tested the shoulders' flexibility. The shoulders had more flexibility without even being stretched. How can that be? Because you sent endorphins and enkephalins through the body, and now you can handle more stretch and more tension, and therefore other parts of your body can go farther than they did before.
Yeah, that's something I know just clinically applying stretching to people I see from a rehab perspective of not only stretching, say, the area that has a potential deficit, but often their most restricted area of their body seems to have such a positive effect on improving whatever other area of the body that you're particularly focusing on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting too, I think, and this is something I'd like to talk a bit more about a little bit later, but stretching as an analgesic effect, because I think there's a lot of things about stretching when we think about its effect on the neural system and even the cardiovascular system that often people don't appreciate how stretching can enhance lots of different systems. But before we go on to that, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is for individuals who want to apply stretching to improve their baseline flexibility or range of movement, the other variables to consider are duration and frequency. And so I know I've read some research suggesting that frequency is a really important factor, but I know with that recent publication that you're involved in, that you suggested that wasn't so important. So when it comes to improving baseline range of movement from doing stretching, how do we configure some of the main variables to maximize that?
Well, as I said, typically you can go 1 to 3 minutes per muscle group and get much greater ranges of motion in a chronic state or a trained state. In terms of stretching, typically with resistance training, we'll say to a person, well, for that same muscle group, you should give 48 or 72 hours of rest. With stretching, you can stretch every day, because the reason we have to give rest during resistance training is we cause those micro tears. And then we need 48 or 72 hours to supercompensate or overcompensate so your muscle gets bigger and stronger. But typically with most stretching, we don't cause the same extent of tears and damage to the muscle. So just like you can probably go for a nice run every day, you can stretch every day. Like you said, though, our meta-analysis show that it's not necessary. You're not going to get much greater gains by stretching every day versus, let's say, stretching 3 days a week.
Just actually on that note, you talked about, say, hypertrophy and micro tears. From what I understand, that seems to be becoming more and more of a controversial hypothesis, because you think of, say, micro tears associated with things like exercise-induced muscle damage, but that doesn't seem to be a key factor associated with hypertrophy, from what I understand. Where, I mean, like you mentioned before, it seems to be that volume and particularly proximity to failure seems to be important, because that's going to maximize the mechanical stress to the more fast twitch fibers, because that's when you're going to recruit your largest motor units.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So it's not necessary to get micro tears. Again, for the average individual, like we said before, it's tension that's the most important. And so obviously in that Varnica studies, they were only stretching, they weren't causing much damage, and they were stretching every day. So, and they still got muscle hypertrophy. So yeah, you're right. You need the tension, you need the volume. The micro tears will cause inflammation, will probably ensure that you need a longer recovery period, maybe 72 hours instead of 48. So a lot of people do cause this damage, but you're right, it's certainly not necessary.
Mm. And the other thing about stretching that I find really interesting, but seems to be not discussed a lot or appreciated, is some of the other systemic effects of stretching. And this is something that I've, again, played around with, thinking about stretching to induce or, say, upregulate the parasympathetic nervous system, and thinking about, does that help with things like recovery? But then also, too, thinking about the stress that stretching applies to the vascular system, and
Mhm.
seeing some of the improvements that we see with things like arterial elasticity and the ability to actually maintain blood perfusion to the stretched muscle. Have you looked a lot into some of the other systemic effects of stretching?
Well, I've mentioned those in some of the reviews I've written, but I haven't directly ever measured that. So
Mm,
again, you're right about the vascular conductance and elasticity and the intima on the vascular. That's all been looked at by other people, and I've seen improvements in those areas. So stretching will have a positive effect on the cardiovascular system. We have looked at, and this was a controversial issue back again in the early 2000s, is whether static stretching would actually decrease injury incidence. And early reviews by a gentleman from Montreal, actually a Canadian named Schreier, said that it wouldn't do that. It wouldn't help prevent injuries. One of your people, a guy named Pope, back in the 1980s and 90s, he did cross-sectional study, and he found in Australian military that stretching would decrease injury incidence. But then he did a longitudinal study with those same military people and found that it didn't. The thing that he did, though, was he measured what's called all-cause injury. So you can imagine that, Joe somebody is running across the field and he puts his foot in a hole and he breaks his ankle. Well,
mm,
that's an injury. Would stretching stop him from breaking his ankle? Well, obviously not. If and then he falls down and has a concussion. Would stretching stop him from having a concussion? Obviously not. But when we looked at the literature, what we found was that if you look at it a bit more closely, that static stretching tends to decrease injury incidence with musculotendinous injuries associated with explosive or explosive change of direction. So if you're doing something explosive, you're sprinting, you're jumping, you're doing agility, then static stretching does seem to have an effect on decreasing the incidence of those types of injuries. But in terms of all-cause injuries, it doesn't have an effect there.
On that, in the prescription of that, David, did you are you able to elucidate, if someone, say for instance, is in one of those more explosive sports, and they stretch, but not with any sort of consistent regularity or prescription, how long it would take for them to start getting the benefits of something like you just mentioned in terms of, muscular tenderness type injury reduction?
Yeah. Well, the limitation is that almost every study that you read is going to be between 4 and 12 weeks.
Yeah.
So the easy answer is 4 to 12 weeks. The question is, why are they all 4 to 12 weeks? Well, you probably know, but maybe not everybody in the audience knows. All our research is done by students, right? It's done by graduate students. How long is a semester? It's about 12 weeks. Wow. Look, all the studies are 12 weeks. It's because that's the semester. And so if you're trying to recruit somebody, let's say in our winter semester, we go from January to April. Well, you've got to test them in early January. You got to test them again in early April because they're all going to leave after their exams. So that leaves you like 10 to 12 weeks to do a training study. So if you're a PhD student, you say, oh, well, I'm going to be here for 3 to 5 years, but your subjects aren't. They're probably students. So that's the easy answer to give, but I don't know whether, longer durations would be better because there's not a lot of studies out there longer than 12 weeks.
Is it important to differentiate the relationship with injury with the positive effect of stretching to reduce injury as opposed to the relationship of flexibility? Because it seems that there's some studies trying to see if there is a correlation between someone's baseline flexibility and injury. Is that different to then someone stretching to prevent injury?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if somebody inherently has a great range of motion, are they going to have less injuries? One of the things that happens when you're stretching is that you tend to be able to develop higher forces at a longer muscle length. So as you know, the force length relationship, I have the highest forces. Where's my bicep there? The highest forces in my bicep is at its optimal length. But if my bicep is at a longer length, I'm going to have fewer forces. So if we think of the hamstrings, which is one of the most common injuries we have, when you're sprinting and then you go to the end of the range of motion, that's where you typically see athletes pulling their muscle because they're weakest at that point. So the stretching gives you more force at those longer lengths. To be honest, I don't really know 100% the answer to this. I would imagine that if you inherently have greater flexibility, then you are not producing greater force at longer lengths. You just have a greater range of motion. So my educated guess, hopefully it's educated, is that inherent flexibility would not provide you with the same safety as a stretching program that provides you with enhanced flexibility.
Using that analogy, it's again, there's something that I think people can underestimate the potential benefit of stretching. Of when you stretch, you see that shift of the length tension relationship to the right, and that's a similar effect to say eccentric training. It might not be to the same magnitude, but it does have a large influence on your muscle tendon behavior. A question I wanted to ask, lost my train of thought now.
You got your questions here, Jack.
Yeah. No, you go on, John.
Oh, I thought, like, given that we've been going a while now, we might actually get onto one of the things that you brought up earlier, which was some of the work that you started looking at in regards to instability training. And I don't know whether you were being facetious, but mentioning Swiss balls and maybe people doing some weird things with them. What did you find when you started to go down that rabbit hole? Because there was, and it's less frequent now, but I still see some dumb videos floating around online of very high level athletes doing some really odd looking things at times. Are they, have they found the cheat code, or are they just being, strange people when they do some of the things that they do?
Well, you're right. The popularity of instability resistance training, or the proper name for it should actually be metastability, because when you're unstable, that means that you're falling over and you cannot get back to your original position. Metastability is the ability to be pushed away from your center of gravity and to return to it. So that's what we want to do. If we're on a slippery slope, or we're again playing on a muddy field. We want to be able to take a perturbation, something that pushes us out of our comfort zone, and return back. We don't want to end up on the ground. So what did we find? Well, our early studies found that when you're unstable, that your forces can drop by 60%. So if you want to build again maximal strength and hypertrophy, then you want to be working at fairly high intensities. So if your force drops by 60%, you're not there. So our first recommendations is that people shouldn't really be using Swiss balls and Bosu balls, etc., if they want the best results. But once again, remember, we're not always talking about the greatest athletes in the world. We're talking about people who just want to get healthy. So one of the other things we found was that even though the forces go down, the muscle activation stays high. So when we're trying to move a barbell or a dumbbell, we have muscles that mobilize, that move the barbell or dumbbell, and then we have muscles that stabilize the joint. So there seems to be a change in the stabilizer to the mobilizer. And so when I'm unstable, I'm spending more time stabilizing my trunk, or let's say my shoulders, or whatever joint I'm using, and therefore using less muscles to mobilize, to move the bar or the dumbbell. So the good news about that is, again, let's say that you're a bit worried about lifting heavy weights. You're novice, or you've never, you don't like the exertion of lifting heavy weights. Well, you can still have high activation and yet lift lower weights if you're unstable. So you can get on a Swiss ball and do your chest flies, or sit on it and do your shoulder presses, or whatever you want to do. And you can be using much lower weights and still get high activation. So in terms of health and moderate increases in strength for the average individual, that's great. Another aspect, of course, is that even for athletes, it can be great, because you're an athlete, you spend 1 week and you're doing high loads and high intensity. The second week, you're again pushing yourself, high loads, high intensity. Well, if you're going to do a periodized training program, you need a week or a phase or a cycle, whatever term you want to use, microcycle, mesocycle, where you're going to decrease the load. But you still want to maintain some intensity. So you can use these devices in an off week, if you want to call it that, or a low load week, where you can keep the activation high, but decrease your loads. And therefore, morphologically, your muscles will get a bit of a break, but your central nervous system is still operating optimally. Maybe I should
You just mentioned
at high intensity.
You just mentioned the word activation, and it's become a very popular term in
At least in our world of
yeah,
physiotherapy, particularly in
and
Australia.
also I think even in sports performance, you hear people calling, I think, what they're called integrated warm ups. Really, they call them, "Oh, let's do our activations," which I find quite annoying. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, you mentioned that you'll get the adaptation from activation, but is that the same thing as getting the amount of tension that we spoke about before? Because it does appear that they are different. And what will be the difference in the adaptation you get from, say, a muscle that's been under high activation versus a muscle that's been under a high amount of mechanical tension?
Yeah. So I asked that to my students today. I said, let's say we've got two people with the exact same muscle circumference. I said, does that mean they're going to have the exact same strength? And is there a difference? So people came up and said, well, the person with more fast twitch fibers, maybe have more strength. But the point I was going to make, or I was trying to emphasize with the class, was that you could have two people with the exact same muscle cross-sectional area, which theoretically should provide you with a very similar force. But if one person can only activate 80% of those fibers and the other person can activate 95%, then you're going to have more force output. So again, for the average individual, if they just want to get stronger and they're not worried about getting the greatest hypertrophy or the greatest strength, they can get stronger by having greater recruitment, better rate coding, more synchronization of motor units, and therefore that activation can help them to become stronger.
On that though, the one thing that um, I get confused about is if you think about, say, EMG analysis, that's what we're referring to with activation, looking at the amount
Mhm.
of EMG activity. If you look at an untrained individual and you develop a particular skill, we see a reduction in the EMG output because the neuromuscular system becomes more efficient.
Yeah,
And part of that is because of the coordination. And this is something that I get confused about because although you're going to see a larger activation, as you suggested, that's probably more because you're getting more of the stabilizer muscles working, which is going to influence the overall force output. And I'm wondering, does that actually confuse the central nervous system? Because if you're, for instance, a sprinter or even to say a power lifter, you want to become very efficient at the neuromuscular pattern to maximize forces at certain positions in a certain direction to complete the lift or complete the running task. If you're doing instability training, you might still maintain activation, but does that confuse the nervous system? Because even though it may look like the output from the central nervous system is high, it's a very different coordination pattern.
absolutely. So remember, I think we've said this about 3 times now. There's a difference between athletes and the average
Mm,
individual. You're absolutely
yeah.
right. I would not recommend a sprinter spending a lot of time on Bosu balls and Swiss balls. I wouldn't recommend an Olympic weightlifter doing the same thing because we showed in another study years ago, Hamlin et al., that doing squats and what else did we do in that? So deadlifts provided the same amount of activation as doing the activities on an unstable surface. So
Mm,
squats are inherently unstable. You've got this big weight on your shoulder and it's moving back and forth. You need to stabilize that. So free weights is an unstable environment. You don't really need
yeah.
to have to add that, the unstable devices to add more. But of course, again, if you're the average individual, you might be afraid of doing squats. That might be scary for you. So for the average individual who's not worried about the coordination, the short amortization period of the stretch shortening cycle, which of course they have no idea what that means, they just want to be healthy, but they don't want to lift heavy weights. So if they want to be healthy,
Yeah.
go ahead and sit on a Swiss ball and lift all day long.
It's interesting. I think what that really highlights is when people ask you questions like, "Is instability training effective?" It's such a general question. It's too vague. If you actually want to get an effective response, you need to be very specific with understanding the context of when you're applying it. I think that's probably like you're alluding to is like where a lot of the confusion comes when people talk about these topics.
Exactly. And again, non-scientists go, well, how can this person publish 40 articles on the same aspect? But we got to look at different populations. And so
Mm,
we've got the youngsters, we've got the young adults, we've got the seniors, we've got the trained, and now you've got the trained youth versus the untrained youth, the trained young adults versus the untrained young adults. Then we got the trained seniors versus the untrained seniors. Then we got the males versus the females, and then it goes on forever. But like we said before, you can't do everything in one study. So you could have a career in one area because there's so many different
mm.
variables that you need to look at, and you can't put them all in one study.
Yeah, actually, on that topic, that's something that I find can be frustrating actually listening to certain researchers because when they present their work, they often present it as if it's an absolute in terms of, okay, this is what we found, therefore, this is what we do to, treat muscle injuries or treat tendinopathies or improve activation. But it's something that I feel like can often be left out is understanding the context in which that study was done with regards to the population characteristics. And yeah, I know it's just probably more just a personal issue I have where I wish it was better communicated, understanding this is a result we got within this particular context.
Yeah. So if you read the methods, it probably said our subjects were such and such. But you're right.
Mm,
Then they might not mention that again throughout the whole paper. And then in the conclusion, just like you said, they'll say this um, this training program did this, and this, but they don't mention again. Oh, it was in 85-year-old women.
yeah, I probably mean it more when they present at conferences or like on live live presentations where you might leave out some of the nuanced detail that may be in the article itself.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
Is there anything, and this is not something that we even put forward to you before, but is there anything that coming along you think in neuromuscular training or resistance training or any of these things we've mentioned that you think is novel, or are we just trying to understand the mechanisms of the application of training in this area that we've been doing for hundreds of years?
Well, uh, there is, of course, like plyometrics. Plyometrics wasn't really known until about 1972 when a Ukrainian or Soviet Union, I can't remember his name, but he won the gold medal in the 100-meter sprint. So we've been looking at plyometrics for about 50 years now, and we've still got meta-analyses and new things going on. So again, there's nuances going on there.
What are you finding there that you think is we're getting a better understanding of as time goes on?
Well, in the world of plyometrics, what we did 30 years ago, in 1993, I published my master's thesis with Digby Sale, and it was on the effect of what we call the ballistic intent. And we were wondering, in terms of velocity specificity, is it the movement speed that is most important, or is the intent to contract explosively the most important? And what we did is we had a group of people, and we actually trained them for 16 weeks. We went crazy and went 16 weeks rather than 12. We trained them in the fall. They went away for Christmas, and they came back and they trained for another 8 weeks. But what we had was one foot was strapped in, so it was an isometric contraction, so there was no velocity, and the other foot was trained at 300 degrees per second. So according to the research prior to that, we would expect that the foot, the dorsiflexors that moved at 300 degrees per second, would have far greater force output at high speeds, and the isometric trained leg would have far greater force output at slow speeds. But what we found was both legs had very high increases at the high speeds when they were tested. So it was the intent, because in both cases, they had intent to explode into the device. One case it moved fast, one case it didn't move at all. So we found that quite interesting. You don't have to move fast. But so what I found, in fact, I'm just writing a book chapter on it now, is that it would be a great idea to mix and match those two ways of training. So again, if you're in a sport that needs strength and hypertrophy, you shouldn't be just doing slow contractions during the off season to get that size. You should still be exploding into the bar, and because you've got heavy weights, the bar is going to move slow. But that's not bad, because you've still got that explosive contraction. You're still teaching the nervous system how to fire at a high frequency. But then you do need that feedback. The cerebellum is called the grand comparator. It compares the intent to the action. So if you never actually get on the field and start doing stretch shortening cycle actions, then you don't teach yourself how to shorten that amortization period. So you do need that feedback. So I'm looking at the interaction between, the ballistic intent and then the plyometrics, which are also ballistic intent, but they have the fast action. And how can we integrate those to get the best effect?
Do you have any other questions, John?
No. The final thing we often ask people is, is there anything that at the moment that you're exploring that's taking your interest? And it often doesn't necessarily have to relate to your professional work, but it's something that, maybe a rabbit hole that you're going down that you're actually personally finding very interesting.
Well, first of all, there's a life after research. Oh.
It must be comedy you're exploring.
Well, actually,
the amount of times we speak to researchers and they go, "Oh, I don't have time to do anything else."
But I do do a bit of reading when I can that's not exercise science related. And what really interests me is astrophysics, black holes, quantum physics. It's just so weird. The way that the universe works and the micro universe works. In fact, I was just reading an article yesterday, and there is a black hole that is 66 billion times bigger than our sun. And it's bigger than the Milky Way. Like, I just can't get my head around how much gravitational force would be in something that is 66 billion times bigger than the sun, and then you get sucked in to that hole. And if you're sitting on the event horizon, then anybody who's watching you thinks that time has stopped. You're not moving. But if you're in the event horizon, then you're being sucked down the hole. So how could somebody watch you be there forever and yet you're being sucked down the hole? It's really, really confusing, but it's really, really interesting.
Is there anything that you take from that you are able to put into your professional work, even if it's a methodology or a way of thinking? I take a lot of inspiration often from reading outside of the fields that we work in, because a lot of the times I do feel like there's analogies that you can pull that actually are very effective. So have you found the same thing in your interest in physics?
I think there's a lot of correlation between stretching and black holes and event horizons. Yeah,
that's right. So you're supposed to get the spaghetti effect when you go down a black hole. So it's very good. But one thing I realized when I'm reading astrophysics is I'm not very smart at all, and I don't know how I've been a scientist for over 30 years and how I've survived. But I'm just glad I never went to astrophysics, because I wouldn't be much of an astrophysicist. But actually, I was reading an article, and again, we just talked about how time, if we go at the speed of light, time stops. A photon, the universe has no time and no space. When it leaves the sun, it automatically is at the Earth. In our view, it takes 12 minutes to hit the Earth. But to a photon, it can go from the sun to Alpha Centauri, and there's no time. And Alpha Centauri is in the same space. So I'm reading some of this stuff about how time is relative. And so then I was thinking about exercise. Now, just imagine you're doing a plank, and you're there and you want to do plank for 60 seconds. What happens at 30 seconds? You say, is it 60 seconds yet? Is it 60 seconds yet? So your perception of time is relative to the activity that you're doing. And so we're actually doing some experiments now. We're having people do muscle contractions of different intensities. We've done it in different age groups, and looking at over a 30-second span, the ability for people to estimate 5, 10, 20, and 30 seconds. And so what we found is that, yes, when you're active, when you're doing contractions, you underestimate time. You think time is going by faster than that actually is. 30 seconds is not 60 seconds. And that relates to a theory that talks about how with arousal that you got more events occurring in a certain period. So when you're bored, you say, oh my God, time's so slow. Well, that's because there's very few events happening when you're bored. But when you're busy, time flies. So when you think of the neuromuscular system, if you're doing a plank or you're doing whatever, then your neuromuscular system is firing. There's a lot of events going on, and therefore time flies, and it's much more relative. So we've been looking at that, and that came from my reading about, the speed of light, Einstein's relative. And what I was really happy about is in one of those studies, I actually quoted Einstein and I referenced Einstein. So I do have
That's amazing.
It's in one of my articles.
Amazing.
Maybe there's an emerging field of research you need to go into, David.
Well,
all right. We won't hold you up any longer. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening. To all our listeners, David made himself available at, I think it was 8 p.m. at your time, I think it was, David. So thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge with us.
All right.
Indeed.
So our university likes us to do these things, and then we're supposed to report back. So what's your podcast called?
Our podcast is called, it's a Melbourne Athlete Development Podcast, and it's called Lateral Think. But what I'll do is we'll finish recording now, and then I'll send you a link once we post it so that you can then share it if you like.
Perfect.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure. Nice talking to you.